Hello and welcome to our commentary on The Chosen. My name is Dr. Scott Hepfelfinger, and I'm joined by my good friend and my colleague, Dr. Michael Barber, and we are very blessed to teach in the Graduate School of Theology here at the Augustine Institute. And we're also very blessed to have the opportunity to offer our thoughts on this series, The Chosen. If you missed our introductory episode, there we talk a little bit about what The Chosen is, what we are doing, why we're doing it, the way that we're approaching this. So we encourage you to take a look at that, and also if you're interested, our commentary on episode 1. But today, we are looking at episode 2, which is entitled The Sabbath.
Now, this is an interesting episode. It kind of has a flashback at the beginning. It takes us back to 948 BC at Chinnereth, which is basically a town, an ancient town we read about in the Old Testament, in the book of Numbers, in the book of Joshua, situated next to the Sea of Galilee. Let's go to the first clip here.
Was there a Shabbat when you were little?
Of course, since the time of the covenant.
Every 7 days. Why so many, Savta?
Shabbat is a time for rest and time to honor 3 things: family, our people, and God.
Family like Savta and Sabah?
Yes, and you, Ima and Abba, of course. Close friends are like family too.
Who else?
We honor our fellow citizens on Shabbat.
Strangers, Savta?
We are all God's people, even friends we haven't met. But most important of all, we honor God and all his works. We rest because he rested on the 7th day. We rest to refresh our souls, to know him better.
It's a great scene where she's talking with her son, and this emphasis on rest, this emphasis on family, on the people, God's chosen people, and of course on God himself.
That's right. Now, this scene is situated in a real-life place, the Sea of Galilee. We can go to the slide here. You see a picture of the Sea of Galilee as it is today. You can go there and take pilgrimages. I've been there. It's an amazing place. Where is this within Israel? Well, if we wanted to look at the next slide, we can see the map of the Holy Land. You see Galilee up north. You see Jerusalem in Judea down south. You see that little dot, that little lake there. That's the Sea of Galilee. Now, the scene takes place in 948 BC, as we said. It's a little unclear to me why they decided on this particular date. If you're going to follow the standard Bible timeline, this would take place during the reign of King Solomon. And there are lots of anachronisms here. The Talmud actually places that Kiddush prayer to the 6th to 4th centuries. And it seems unclear when ancient Israelites were celebrating the Sabbath. Perhaps the first written reference to the Sabbath seems to be the book of Amos. There's also the use of Proverbs 31,
Right.
which is an amazing text in Scripture that extols the virtuous wife. And we see that being used as part of the Shabbat celebration, the Sabbath celebration. Now, that was used, and it did become part of Jewish Sabbath celebrations, but not really until like the 17th century. So it's more of a recent development.
Sure. So we see that there are some anachronisms here.
Yes.
We probably don't actually know a whole lot about how these early
Right.
Sabbath celebrations went.
Right.
But if we step back and say, okay, so, it's not perfect, but with this date, long time ago, right?
That's right.
And so what they're setting up is a picture of the antiquity of this celebration, that it's hard to even imagine, in a way, God's chosen people without a day set aside for rest.
Right. This is a special, distinctive marker of the Jewish faith, of ancient Israel's faith. You don't really see an institution like the Sabbath, a weekly day of rest, in other pagan cultures. Where does it come from? Obviously, it comes from the biblical story, and we see this in the book of Genesis. We see the establishment of the Sabbath in Genesis. We go back to Genesis chapter 1. Let's go to the slide here, guys. Genesis chapter 1, we read the creation narrative, And God said, let there be light. And there was light, and God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. Now notice here the emphasis on the evening first.
Right, and just like we saw in this opening clip, they're preparing the celebration in the evening. It's not sort of like sun up, here we go, but this is the evening beforehand.
That's right, because for ancient Jews, the day begins at sundown, right? So in the evening, just as in Genesis here. And we also see in the Catholic tradition the same basic idea, right? That we can celebrate, for example, Sunday on Saturday evening. We'll often go to Mass on Saturday, or we have Christmas Eve,
right?
For example, a part of our Christian tradition. All right, so in Genesis 2, at the end of the story of creation, we read, and God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because God rested from his work that he had done in creation. So unlike here, where we're constantly doing construction work at the AI, even on the weekend, and people might hear some construction work going on in the background here, God makes a point of resting on the seventh day here, and that becomes the basis for ancient Israelites' practice of the Sabbath, which is rooted in a principle we see in the book of Leviticus. If we can go back to the slides to Leviticus chapter 9, verse 2, we read in Leviticus 9, verse 2, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord God, am holy.
Right. And in the earlier passage from Genesis, this is the first time in the Bible that we have the word holy. And so we have some Jewish commentators who point out that creation is good, and at its completion, it's very good, but it's actually only with the arrival of the Sabbath and this day of rest that we have something that is holy. And that word, we might talk about what it means to be holy. In Leviticus, when it says, you shall be holy, for the Lord your God is holy, what is the sense of this word holy?
Right. The basic idea is that it's set apart. Right. Holiness is to be set apart. So there's a day that is holy because it's set apart from the other days. And specifically what the Israelites are supposed to do is not just worship, but actually rest, which actually is a sort of concrete manifestation of faith.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of rest was more or less unknown, at least in this regular fashion, right? This having one whole day set apart was basically unknown in the ancient world. And so to do this is precisely to say we sacrifice our productivity, and think about at this time, right, the need for kind of continuing in agriculture and survival. And so to say we will not work on this day is also tantamount to saying because we trust in the Lord our God. It's this act of faith.
That's right. Yeah, it takes an act of trust to not put your faith in the work of your hands.
Right.
When all of your neighbors are still out there working and still being productive, to say, you know what, I'm going to stop and I'm going to recognize that I need to trust in God first and not in my own ability to produce for myself. You are really putting in a way your money where your mouth is, right?
And it's fascinating because in the ancient world, as nowadays, the idea of worship was common, right? Now, it might be pagan, polytheistic worship, all these different things, but worship was actually not precisely, you could say, what set the Jewish people, God's chosen people, apart. Instead, it's this idea of rest, right? This was really kind of the distinctive mark. And so that kind of makes sense in that opening clip that we saw. The wife and mother there, she actually, in saying, what is the Sabbath about? The first thing she mentions is rest. And actually, she ends her list with God, which isn't to say that God isn't important, but maybe it's a sign that, what's really kind of distinctive and set apart here is the fact that they're setting apart one day of the week for resting.
Right. Certainly, it's important that they worship this one God, right? And they offer sacrifice to this one God. But there's this practical dimension that you don't put your faith in the work of your hands. which, by the way, is another way of describing idolatry in the Bible, is to worship the work of your hands. So there's a real practical takeaway here and a practical manifestation of faith in not resting. So in the episode,
Yeah.
we see that Peter is going to work on the Sabbath. And this does sort of fit, at least in one kind of way, with the gospel presentation of Luke. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus, and the other gospels, Jesus constantly berates the disciples for being people of little faith or having no faith, right? Well, it takes a lot of faith to not work on the Sabbath.
And this idea of the Sabbath, this idea of the faith that it takes not to work on the Sabbath, this is going to be kind of a golden thread actually throughout this episode that we see. So this opening clip of the Sabbath rest is in a way in contrast to how Peter's character is going to develop. And so
Right.
this kind of comes to a head in one of the clips that we have here. So if we can play the next clip.
You haven't taken a catch to market for days.
And yet you have flour, vegetables. Did you sleep in a warm bed last night?
In fits.
Why are you baiting me?
I don't understand what's happening.
Nothing is
You don't sell
happening.
to market. Your hours are upside down. And your face is frozen in worry. Don't tell me nothing is happening.
We're in a challenging season right now. I just need to work hard to get through it, and I'll get caught up tonight, and I'll be right on the way.
Tonight? What do you mean?
I'm not happy about this either. I need to work tonight
You
so that
need to work on Shabbat.
it's a special circumstance. I can't get into it right now. Andrew will be here for dinner as normal, and I'll just be gone for a few hours.
Oh, well, would you like me to fix your Shabbat plate to take with you?
Listen, love, I know this is
Don't
not
listen,
ideal.
love me. I'm not a child.
I just need you to trust me on this. Please? I've got this, Eden.
You answer to God, not me.
You answer to God, not me. That's, she's doing what she should do as the good wife, and so all of this work and some of the issues that we'll talk about come to a head in this scene as Peter comes home. His wife is not happy, and she's not happy especially to hear that he's going to go out and work on the Sabbath.
And this is why she's a good wife, like
Exactly, yeah.
Proverbs 31, right?
Precisely.
So it starts
Yep.
with that passage from Proverbs 31 that talks about the virtuous wife, and she really is Peter's wife here in the story, presented as Eden, right? In the Chosen. She's presented as a faithful woman. Now, what is this? Peter had a wife? This might be surprising to a lot of people. We do see evidence that Peter was married in the Gospels. Go to the slides here. Of course, we read in the Synoptic Gospels about Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law.
Yep.
So we do know that Peter had a mother-in-law.
But it's interesting, right, that all three synoptics mention the mother-in-law.
That's right.
None of them mention his wife being there.
This is interesting. And it also is interesting that they do mention that the mother-in-law got up and served after
Right.
she was healed. And you wonder, well, where's Peter's
Exactly,
wife?
yeah.
Is she alive? Is she serving? There is another passage in 1 Corinthians 9 that seems to indicate that Peter, the other apostles, travel with a wife. That's a common way of translating that passage. The idea that Peter was married and that he had children is also recorded in the early church. Clement of Alexandria tells us that Peter's wife was martyred right before him. So part of the cruelty shown to Peter was that the last thing he saw was his wife die. And there's also in the Acts of Peter, which is a traditional source that we have a lot of information about Peter being crucified upside down, for example, in the tradition, that Peter had a child named Petronilla. And so, okay. Now, of course, this is just important to point out that there are these apocryphal stories of Peter in the early church that sort of does what the Chosen also does, which is give us a fuller depiction of Peter's life. We don't know how much these sources are dependent on tradition and how much of these presentations are more imaginative. We have an ancient early Christian work known as the Proto-Evangelium of James, which gets a lot of details just wrong about first century Judaism. And so there's no way that is relying on traditional material. But anyway, at least in certain cases, we do know that later church tradition following Paul's advice in 1 Corinthians 7 would mandate clerical celibacy so that the clergy, the leaders of the church, would not be married. But that tradition isn't practiced in all places in the early church, and not even today. It's not even practiced everywhere in the Catholic Church today. There are Eastern Rite, for example, Catholic priests who are married.
It is true that celibacy is held up as, in a way, a higher standard to live up to. But it's true, it's not universally practiced. And it's something that is gradually brought into play, particularly in the Western church. So, I mean, the sum total...
And it's celebrated because St. Paul says it is better not to be married. So
based
Paul
on
actually
Christ
does say
himself,
that.
right.
So Paul actually does say that. It's not like, oh, they just made this up out of nowhere, out of whole cloth. I remember one time I was on an airplane, and this guy was telling me he used to be Catholic. And he said, now I've discovered that the Catholic Church teaches all kinds of things that are against the Bible. And I said, oh, like what? And he said, well, the idea that priests shouldn't get married. I said, well, actually, that's in 1 Corinthians 7. He said, no, it's not. I said, well, let me show you. I opened up to his Bible. So, so there is biblical precedent for some of this. But let's talk about this characterization of Peter. What do you think of the way Peter's presented here in The Chosen, Scott?
Yeah, so, when we have been talking about this, I will just say that the character of Peter, I enjoy watching him in The Chosen, but he's one of the characters that I'm kind of least satisfied with based on how I have imagined Peter, based on the Gospels, based on reading and meditating on the Gospels. And so there are many parts that are hard for me to kind of see. But the great thing is, and we mentioned this in our intro episode, for those moments where I'm kind of like, I wouldn't view Peter that way, or I wouldn't have presented him that way, it sends me back to Scripture, right? To kind of look at some of these passages that illuminate the character of not only Jesus, but also his first followers, the apostles. And so the way that Peter seems to be depicted, and we'll see how this changes as things go on, right? But he is kind of a schemer, right? He's always got a plan. He's always sort of like conniving a little bit. You don't know if you can really trust him, whose side he's on. He seems to be only on his own side. He's in debt. He hasn't paid his taxes. He seems to be gambling. The way he's introduced in this series, which is a kind of masterful creative stroke in a certain sense, is there's this guy in the middle of a fight, right? Hand-to-hand fighting, and it's for money, basically. And you're like, oh, that's St. Peter. So, he's a very interesting, but really the word that I think that captures Peter as he's presented is that he's a schemer. He's got plans, and he thinks of himself.
Yeah, and it seems like he's maneuvering, and he also really wants to be rich. Like, he's a poor guy who really wants to have a payday. Right, exactly. And, okay, you're being very charitable and saying you enjoy it. I will tell you, I have a very hard time watching The Chosen and seeing Peter portrayed this way, simply because this is not the Peter, the character that I know of from the Gospels. And let me be clear, it's not because I have a problem seeing faults with Peter. I certainly think it's possible, and not just possible, it's certainly the case that Peter is depicted a flawed man in the Gospels. So I have no problem with that. But it's the way that they describe him, this kind of maneuvering, or as you put it, this scheming. Peter doesn't seem to have a plan in the Gospels. He seems to be rather rash in the Gospels. I'll give you a few examples. Here's a great artist depiction of Peter and Jesus and some of the other disciples talking. It reminds me of John 6, right? Where Jesus talks about the need to eat his flesh and drink his blood. I'll be interested to see how The Chosen portrays that scene in John chapter 6. Now, after Jesus has been talking about the need to eat his flesh and drink his blood and many disciples withdraw from him because they say, this is a hard saying. Jesus then turns to the disciples and he says, do you also wish to leave? And Peter's response is really interesting. He says, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. It's almost like Peter saying, you got any recommendations? Is there anybody you think I should be looking at here? I mean, I feel like I'm stuck, right? But he doesn't seem like he's got a plan. In another scene in the Gospel of Matthew, you have these people who collect the temple tax, and they come to Jesus. And actually, first they come to Peter and they ask Peter whether or not Jesus pays the temple tax. And Peter says, yes, definitely. Of course he does. And then Jesus ends up back at his house. Peter ends up back at his house with Jesus. And then Jesus begins to teach him about the temple tax. But it seems like Peter didn't know the answer. He was just giving an answer off the top of his head without really knowing what he was getting himself into with those words.
That's right. This is a pattern. I mean, in John 13,
Yes.
when Jesus is telling him that he's going to wash his feet, and Peter's like, what? No. And Jesus says, if I don't wash you, then you won't be clean.
Right. I love Ford Maddox Brown's presentation of this. We got a picture of it there on the slide because Peter's looking at him like, no, I don't like this at all. Right.
And then, but before that, he's sort of like, after Jesus says, if I don't wash you, you won't be clean. And Peter's sort of like, well, then not just my feet, but my head. And, and he doesn't have this kind of like clever streak. He's impulsive. And he is impulsive. One of the characteristics that we see that is a fault in the Gospels. Right?
That's right. Another example of this is in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus is arrested. Here we've got another image of this. There we read in the Gospel of John how Peter attacked the high priest's slave and cut off his ear. Now, just a few moments later, Peter's going to be hiding. He's going to be denying that he knows Jesus. He doesn't seem to be cognizant of the fact that cutting off someone's ear might get him into hot water. He's acting rashly and impulsively here, and Jesus actually has to tell him to cool it.
Yeah, and in some ways that impulsiveness is almost the opposite of the kind of restraint that you have to sort of be a schemer and a planner, right?
Right.
But that thinking in bigger terms, we just don't see that. So again, in John, when after Jesus has been captured, Peter is standing around the fire. There are, all these people standing around the fire with him. And this, of course, is the tragic moment when he denies knowing Christ. But you kind of think to yourself, if you had a plan, you wouldn't be like right there with everybody else when this is sort of like the talk of the town,
Right.
And so he's just not thinking in that way.
Right. And then, of course, you have the scene in John 21, where Jesus appears in Galilee and Peter's on the boat and he sees Jesus on the shore and he jumps into the water and wants to be with Jesus. And of course, that reminds us of the earlier scene where Jesus is walking on the water and Peter says, Lord, let me come out on the water. Right. And then after he gets out on the water, he thinks to himself, wait, what am I doing here? How is this happening?
What have I done?
And he begins to doubt. Yeah.
This character, I mean, it even comes up you pointed out to me in St. Paul. Like Paul sort of hints at this. How does that play out in Galatians?
Right. Well, in Galatians, Paul tells us about an episode that took place at Antioch where Peter didn't seem to really understand how to deal with some of the complexities of the issues arising from Jews and Gentile believers in Christ who are eating together. And Paul ends up condemning Peter from withdrawing from the Gentiles. Again, it doesn't really seem like Peter's all that politically savvy, doesn't really have a plan, doesn't really seem to know what he's doing in the moment, and Paul calls him on the carpet for it.
Which again is kind of the opposite of how you see Peter trying to sort of be politic and persuasive in the tavern scenes where he's kind of warming people up, he's buying them drinks, and he's sort of working the room, and all of this, and you're kind of like, that doesn't match what St. Paul said.
Right. It really doesn't fit with that. And by the way, that whole scene in the tavern has also got other historical questions. There's really limited evidence that there were taverns like that in the first century. But I got to wonder, look, I'll just be honest, as a Catholic watching this, Peter is traditionally the kind of Catholic apostle. And so watching this show and seeing all of these flaws that are being added to Peter's character, a part of me wonders, is there kind of a Protestant bias here wanting to knock Peter down a peg or so. I don't know, a little bit of concern there, but my biggest concern is this just doesn't feel like the character of Peter, the kind of man that I read about in the Gospels.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I could imagine from the producer's side, they're actually looking towards what is a kind of Catholic principle of grace building on nature.
Right.
And so they're trying to find a sort of set of characteristics that, supplemented and elevated by grace, might help like the leader of the apostles. But it just doesn't seem to jibe well with the gospel testimony. So why invent these things?
Right, why add these things?
There are already things in the gospels where we find faults, but then we also do find some bases for thinking that Peter, with the grace of the Lord, will in fact be a leader, will in fact be the leader of the church, the first pope.
Right, yep. And I'll also just add that if this was coming from a kind of fully Catholic imagination, there is a tradition that's a small t tradition, but we found a church on the shore of Galilee in Capernaum that Franciscans sort of take care of. And this ancient church was built on a first century house. And the Catholic tradition, again, small t, is that this was probably Peter's house. This is, now again, we don't know for sure, but people have long thought that this might have actually been Peter's house. And what's interesting about it is it's not a small house. It's a pretty prominent house. And it might suggest that Peter was a bit better off than he's being portrayed here in The Chosen, as a guy who's just trying to make ends meet and he's desiring to make it rich. And there's actually some basis for this in the gospel story.
Right.
In
Mark's gospel, for example.
Right. We see in Mark's gospel, we see that when Jesus calls Peter, he's working with partners. So he seems to have a kind of fishing business. And this is especially emphasized in Mark's gospel, Mark 2:7. And there is an ancient tradition that Mark's gospel is based on Peter's own testimony. So that little detail about Peter having business partners, not kind of being the Lone Ranger, just him and Andrew off on their own trying to make ends meet, doesn't really seem based on a close reading of Mark. But I would just say if I was doing this again from a Catholic perspective, it seems kind of be missing some of that Catholic imagination. It seems to be coming out of not a kind of established understanding of what the various traditions are regarding Peter.
Right. So I think, what we see in the gospel and within the Catholic tradition, we see these kind of incipient qualities of the leadership that would be required to lead the church, right? Mm-hmm. He's working with partners.
That's right.
The archaeological evidence, he might be a man of means,
We don't know.
We don't know, but
yeah.
He put these pieces together, and this seems to be, perhaps the most probable depiction of the gospel. Now, it's also clearly the case that in the gospel, Peter has faults, right? His impulsiveness, his lack of faith. But one of the things that I love about Peter in the gospel is just his simplicity, right? Mm-hmm. And this to me is sort of the opposite of that scheming. And it's that simplicity of Peter that I think post-Pentecost is sort of consolidated into the almost strong, single-minded leader that you see who's preaching to the church. So, this is sort of, I think, a little bit our view of St. Peter in The Chosen. And we're going to watch how this develops, but for now, we can say that about Peter.
Right. Okay, let's turn to another character. And as we explained before, we're not going to be able to offer an in-depth, kind of detailed, minute-by-minute commentary on every episode. And I think that might be a little boring, too, for people. But we're going to focus on major characters. So we've talked a little bit about Peter. And by the way, I'll just say my preference is the old Franco Zeffirelli, Jesus of Nazareth, where I think they really depict this image of Peter well. But let's turn to another character here, and that is Matthew. And we see Matthew in a really interesting scene from the first episode. We didn't talk about that when we looked at that first episode. So we're going to show a clip here now from the first episode, Matthew the tax collector in the marketplace. Let's go to that clip.
I see him. Please. Are you the Messiah? Are you the Messiah?
No, I'm not.
Please, tell me when he comes. Please.
You're late, Gaius.
I know. Could you feel it?
Feel what?
Market's on fire today. Everybody's on edge. All it would take is one person to snap, and you are.
Just do your job.
Better hope.
Ouch. What I like about this, so let me talk about something I like here. I like the way that it is helping us understand the dynamic that a tax collector would have faced in a first century Jewish context, right?
Yeah.
That the tax collectors who are Jews would have been seen as traitors to their own people. The Romans, again, are brutal. They're savage to the Israelites. Matthew is really a turncoat by working with them. And I like the way Gaius is basically warning him, hey, it's like a tinderbox here. Just a little spark and that's it. I think you're toast, buddy.
That's right. And what also comes through, and we talked about this earlier, is the complexity of these relationships, right? There's the Roman rulers, right? There's the Jewish people. And then Matthew is in this very awkward place in between them. So it's easy to kind of overlook what a complex political situation there is. And that's obviously going to have ramifications further on when it comes to Jesus' trial and crucifixion. So we have a lot of these points. But in episode 2, we begin to see Matthew's character developing a little bit more. So let's go to a clip from episode 2 that brings some themes together.
All right, great.
Matthew, another unhappy citizen expressing his disapproval?
I'll be fine.
Oh, you're disgusting. Go home.
I have a job to do. My father never allowed me to shirk responsibility.
Well, he raised you right. You must have Roman blood.
We don't speak.
Jews are odd.
People are.
How can you not have a relationship with your own father?
He says he has no son. Next.
So I find this to be a fascinating insight because, like you mentioned about the animosity maybe felt towards tax collectors, we see that clearly in Matthew's sort of nursing his wounds after someone's gotten upset and irate, and it looks like they've kicked him, and somehow his face has gotten injured, and so there's that part, right? And Gaius comes over, and he is sort of like saying, well, your work ethic, you're going to stick it out here, and you must have Roman blood. And so there's, again, this kind of complexity where there's the Jewish people, but they're with the Romans, and the Romans have a certain idea of nobility and hard work, and Matthew's maybe imbibed some of that. But then there's this idea, right, that Matthew starts to point out the issues that he has with his father.
Yeah, and you can see here the complexity of Matthew's character. Matthew has a hard time with relationships, and there's a sense here that maybe Matthew doesn't just have a hard time relating with his father either. Matthew, the producers have explained, is meant to be understood as autistic in some way. He's on the autistic spectrum in some way. And you can see here as a fittingness to one dimension of the gospel narrative, that those who are sick are in need of a physician. Those who are not sick do not need a physician, Jesus explains in the Gospels. And so Matthew is an imperfect character.
That's right. And I actually like this. So we should say, of course, there's nothing really in the biblical accounts that would lead us in this direction for a depiction of someone on the spectrum, someone autistic in some way. What I kind of appreciate about it is this precise point, that God's condescension, he comes to those who are in need. There's also clearly, I think, in the producers' minds here, an awareness of oftentimes, and maybe in former times more than now, kind of a taboo around mental health, and so they're lifting that up where Gaius says, you're odd, and Matthew sort of says, people are odd. Like we all have our oddities in some way. And as we know the story as it goes, that's not going to prevent Jesus from coming into our lives, right? And saving us and healing us in some way. So the kind of oddities of Matthew and the trouble that he has with relationships, I actually find that kind of endearing rather. Even though there's nothing, I wouldn't say this is a biblical depiction, but it is an application, and again, that artistic license, a creative interpretation of a biblical principle, which is that Jesus didn't come for the healthy, right? They don't need a physician. He came for the sick, for those of us who struggle and suffer in some way.
All right, so I don't mean to be the fly in the ointment here, just be negative for the sake of being negative, but I'll give you my honest opinion here. I struggle with the presentation of Matthew as well here. If anyone was going to be a schemer or to be maneuvering, I would think that they would make Matthew the schemer and the maneuverer. I'm surprised that they attribute that to Peter rather than Matthew. The idea that Matthew is somehow autistic, that this relates to his fascination with numbers as a tax collector. I mean, we know that people who are really interested in numbers, maybe some people like that can be kind of odd, I guess. But I would say that there's more going on here. Matthew seems awfully young to me.
Sure.
He's a tax collector. It seems that Matthew, if he was a tax collector, would have probably been a little bit better with people. I mean, he would have got himself in the position where the Romans would trust him. So it seems like he would have to have a little bit more credibility. Priests couldn't serve until they were about 30 years old. And so Matthew looks awfully young for that here. I'll also just point out that scribes would have made a perfect person to be a kind of tax collector. And there's a way the tradition kind of merges ideas here. Of course, in the tradition, the Gospel of Matthew is associated with the tax collector Matthew. And the reason for that is in Matthew 13, the gospel writer seems to describe himself as a scribe. And so a person who had been trained, most people weren't literate in the ancient world, person who's trained, a person who can write. Scribes, often Jewish rabbis will tell you that scribes were those who could count. They had to count all the letters when they copied the biblical books. They wanted to make sure they did it accurately, so they would count every word. So counting, scribes, tax collector, it all kind of goes together here. And I really struggle with that because the Gospel of Matthew is the clearest in many ways of all the Gospels. Mark loves ambiguity. Stark, dark, laconic Mark is one way John P. Meyer famously described Mark. Matthew's very clear. In Mark, Jesus talks about, Elijah must come. In Matthew's gospel, right after Jesus says that, Matthew says, and he was talking about John the Baptist. Matthew wants to be very clear. So Matthew, the character of Matthew that emerges from the tradition, a kind of Catholic imagination of Matthew, doesn't seem like the Matthew that I see here in The Chosen, but that's just my take.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I think what's clear is the way they're presenting this, and this is fascinating, and I think artistically speaking, really well done, where there's this strong contrast between Peter and Matthew. They're foils for each other.
Definitely.
So whereas Peter is poor, Matthew is clearly wealthy.
That's right.
Peter is uneducated. Matthew seems to be highly educated.
Yep.
Peter is sort of the schemer. Matthew has this kind of odd simplicity about him. But even more important, and this will take us back in the direction that we want to go, is in relation to the Sabbath, right?
Yep.
What happens is that Matthew is seen as betraying his own people by being a tax collector.
Right.
But that is what Peter is in fact doing by reporting on those, being set up to report on those who are fishing on the Sabbath. He's betraying his people. And then what's more, we see that Peter is going out to work on the Sabbath. We talked about that, right? He's not honoring the Sabbath, whereas Matthew, even though he's supposedly a traitor to his people, he seems like he's prepared a little Sabbath meal and he's trying to find some way to sort of celebrate the Sabbath. So fascinating contrast between these characters. But why don't we move back in the direction of the Sabbath?
Sure.
Because this is
do we want to show that last clip?
Yeah, let's show that clip.
All right, so there's a last clip here of the various Sabbath meals, and we see how they're all celebrating the Sabbath, but in different ways.
Yeah.
Is the first star out?
Yes, let's eat. Like I said, you are very popular.
Or it's a Pharisee here to shut us down for letting you be here.
Hello, Mary.
Hello.
It's good to see you.
Yes. Yes.
I don't want to be rude, but would it be okay if I...
Oh, yes, of course. Please come in. I just never thought you'd, I have guests here. This is my first time. I don't know what I'm doing.
Rabbi.
All right, so here we see Jesus come to Mary Magdalene's Sabbath presentation. And I like the way that Jesus is presented as the one that the Sabbath sort of is pointing all Jews forward to, right? Jesus fulfills the hopes for the Sabbath. And there's a beautiful tradition of understanding that in the Old Testament, the Sabbath comes at the end of the week because in the Old Testament, Israel's waiting for the coming of the Messiah. And so here Jesus arrives. Now, I'll just say, I got a little bit of a problem with the way this is presented when Jesus shows up and he says, well, would it be okay? And he's really passive and he basically lets Mary Magdalene invite him into her Sabbath. This doesn't really fit, again, with the character of Jesus that I see in the Gospels. I know they're trying to present Jesus as meek and gentle, but when I go back and look at Jesus in the Gospels, it's not the Jesus that I see, at least in this particular. So let me go to Luke 19. We got a slide here, the story of Jesus inviting himself to the tax collector's Zacchaeus' house. So if we go to the slide here, guys, Luke 19:5. Jesus sees Zacchaeus, the tax collector, in a tree, and he says, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. Jesus is very direct. He's very clear. And I don't see that same kind of confident sort of, that's not the word, not confident, but that kind of decisive, that kind of powerful Jesus in this scene with Mary Magdalene. And it is difficult, right? How are you going to portray Jesus as powerful, as direct, but also gentle and meek?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the challenge. What they're going for is this winsome, gentle, kind Jesus. But it's hard for us to put together in our minds or to hold together in our minds that meekness, that kindness, that gentleness with the decisiveness of the eternal Word of God become man, right? With that firmness and that strength. It's hard to do, but it's a little jarring to see such a kind of passive, deferential approach, I think. But it is beautiful, as you said. I love this arrival. There's a Jewish commentator I love, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who talks about how the Jewish people wait for the Sabbath like a bridegroom waits for the bride. And do we welcome the Sabbath in this way, with this kind of expectation?
Right. And this is a great episode for me in that it reminds me of the practical application of the Sabbath for ancient Jews, the way that it was an important institution for Jews of all kinds of different social standing. There's a scene where you see Nicodemus celebrating the Passover. You see Mary Magdalene celebrating the Passover. Nicodemus, more wealthy. Mary Magdalene, obviously less means. But the key idea here is there's this institution that unites all ancient Jews.
That's right. And I think, one application for us, maybe just as we come to the end here, is we sometimes are looking for, well, what kind of witness can we give to our faith that's just like countercultural? And I think we often firstly think of sort of like clobbering people with the truth, like, I'm going to give them the right argument or the right answer. And there's a place for that kind of apologetic for sure. But how countercultural is it at this time? And how countercultural would it be for us to really take seriously what it means to rest on the Sabbath, which for us, of course, after the resurrection, is Sunday, the Lord's Day, the transference to Sunday in light of Easter, the 8th day. So I think, going back to that opening line that this mother and wife had, if we value, and this is what the Catechism actually basically says about, this is a very Catholic portrayal in a way of how to live out the Sabbath rest, the Sunday rest, to actually rest, to care for our families, to serve those in need, to worship God above all, to meditate and pray, to enjoy culture, all of these leisurely ways of celebrating and resting. And if we did that, sort of wholeheartedly, consistently, avoiding shopping on Sundays, that would be not only transformative, I think, in our lives, but a profound and powerful witness to the world.
Mm-hmm. Well said. All right. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this commentary on this episode. We've got plenty more in store. We're going to be looking at the Christmas episode, and we've got a special standalone episode coming up here as well. So stay tuned. Please make sure if you enjoy this, we'd love to hear your comments in the comment box, or if you've got questions, love to hear those. And do please share this with your friends and let them know about our commentary series. Until next time, may God bless your study of His Word.